Hi, I'm Doug from Dynamic Computing, and welcome to episode 120 of 10-Minute Amiga Retrocast. This week we're going to be revisiting my Amiga 3000, which, as you guys know, is probably about my favorite Amiga ever created. I did a video all about the Amiga 3000, the history, and mine in particular. You can see a link right there. And then a couple of months back, my Amiga 3000 had a traumatic event happen, and she died. And so I sent her in to Chucky Hertel, and he put all of the parts into a brand new Amiga 3000 motherboard of his own design, basically a copy of the original with some enhancements. You can see a video for that right there, and that had its own series of misadventures where there were some bad components on it. He replaced it at no charge. He's the man. Now, in a nutshell, my Amiga 3000 has been running with a 68030 at 25 megahertz just fine for months since I got it back from Chucky. Got a nice 32 gig SCSI to SD hard drive in there by inertial computing. Works just fine. But for years, I've owned 3 of these Amiga A3640 boards here. These are the ones that came with the Amiga 4000 when it first came out, and put its CPU in there, which is a 68040 running at 25 megahertz, full FPU, full MMU. I own 3 of these boards, and I thought I really need to use one in my Amiga 3000 to bring it up to, you know, 040 performance. Now let's talk about the 3640 for a moment. It is not known as a fast motherboard or a fast CPU board, and it never has been. Even back in the early 90s, I remember reading reviews about the CPU boards available for the Amiga 3000 and 4000, and these were always on the bottom of the heap as far as performance. There's a reason for that. First of all, they were the first generation boards. When they came out with the 100-pin CPU socket for the 3000, this was the first kind of board that was available for it, so they kind of started the market there. These boards don't have any fast RAM on them, nor do they have any hard drive controllers. So they're reliant on the motherboard RAM of the 3000 or 4000 and the hard drive controller of the 3000 or 4000, both of which cause some performance bandwidth. Newer CPU accelerators that add their own RAM on board and have their own hard drive controllers are much, much faster in those departments. But this isn't bad. That doesn't make this a bad board at all. Now, while it's alluded to in the name, being an A3640, that this was an Amiga 3000 compatible board, and it was. They designed it to be for the 3000. It just didn't work in the Amiga 3000 desktop. The form factor fits just fine, but it just was too hot and it had other issues, and so Commodore never recommended these boards for the Amiga 3000. They said use them in your Amiga 4000, you'll be fine. But they're sort of compatible, and we're going to work on that today. This one happens to be a Rev 3.1 board that's now been upgraded to a Rev 3.2, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. The original Rev 3.0s pretty much, as a rule, don't work in the Amiga 3000 at all without being upgraded. And the upgrades aren't hard. It's just a matter of a few bodge wires, maybe replacing a gal or two. But the 3.1 and the last generation 3.2 boards do theoretically work in the Amiga 3000, but not perfectly. Now, one of the biggest issues about the A3640 boards in the Amiga 3000 is heat buildup, and we're using a heatsink with it. But I think I have that problem licked. I'm just going to modify this heatsink here that's on this motherboard and put that inside my Amiga 3000. That'll work, won't it? Now, this is our little Amiga 3000 with the drive bay taken off. Up here we've got the power supply and the drive bay separately, so we're looking at things like the RAM, and you'll notice on Chucky's board it uses a different kind of RAM, but the general layout is the same, including the jumpers we're going to deal with, which are right here, and we're going to talk about those right now. The Amiga 3000 has several jumpers that need to be adjusted to get any card to work in the CPU slot. Basically, it changes where the system gets its timing from. Now, you also really should use a more modern ROM. 2.04, 2.05 will sort of work, but don't even bother. Just get yourself a 3.1 or 3.2 ROM, and you'll have much better luck with the accelerators. The first jumper we're going to deal with is right here behind the buster. This is J100. Now, J100, which is right here, has to be moved from pins 1 and 2 on the left to pins 3 and 4 on the right. This is the quad clock multiplier. So you pull up the jumper from these first 2 pins, move it to the second set of 2 pins. Now the second ones are going to be 102 and 104. 102 is right here. This is the board clock. It needs to be moved from pins 1 and 2 and moved over 1 to pins 2 and 3. This only has 3 pins on it. So from 1 and 2 over to 2 and 3. Same thing for the CPU clock here, from 1 and 2 over to 2 and 3. So move those over. Now, of course, if you ever want to reverse this, you just reverse these instructions. Now down here, we have the floating point unit clock. Normally this is set to internal, so it uses the same clock as the 68030. It needs to be moved down to positions 2 and 3, the bottom positions here. When it's on 1 and 2, it'll use the same clock as the CPU. Now mine was automatically set to 2 and 3 because this little guy has its own 33 megahertz oscillator here, and so it was running the FPU at 33 megahertz automatically. You have a 16 megahertz Amiga 3000. These 2 pins, which are J151 and J152, will be set to 16 megahertz. You need to jumper those over to 25 megahertz. And then on your 16 megahertz board, there's another jumper called J851 that needs to be jumpered from 16 to 25 megahertz. Now, I don't seem to have J851 on my particular board, so I can't show you where it is. The website I'm linking to below has some great instructions and reasons why you have to set the jumpers on the board. So take a look at that website too. So that's it, right? Now I can just put in my 68040 card into the slot right down there. See the 100 pin CPU slot? Turn it on and everything is just hunky-dory, right? Well, absolutely not, and let me explain why. See, once we put the board in here and you put this drive bay back on, the power supply and drive bay, you literally have maybe an inch of clearance from the top of the 6840 CPU, which is right there, to the bottom of the drive bay, which means you have to heat sink this thing to keep it cool, but most heat sinks won't fit inside the case because they'll literally hit the bottom of the case. Now, if you try to run this without a heat sink, you are going to fry your A3640 card and your Amiga. It will boot, especially when the lid is off, it'll boot fine, but as soon as you enclose this, it starts to build up the heat. Everything in here warms up too hot and it just will fry your Amiga. So in my case, I found this nice trim little heatsink here, but the problem is this is a heatsink for a 486 Intel CPU. Boo! They're not quite the exact same die size. So what I had to do is I literally clipped off and shaved off one part of the end over here, and so it now slides right into place, and I'm able to use a little bit of thermal paste and double-sided thermal tape to hold this nice slim heatsink in place, and it still has, you know, maybe a 1/4 inch of clearance to the top of the drive bay. Talk about my particular A3640 cards for a second. Like I said, I own 3 of them. One of them worked, and it worked okay. One of the SMD capacitors was hanging on just by a thread. Oh my goodness, it was just barely hanging on there, but it functioned. The other 2, nothing at all. I never got any response from either of them over the past 15, 18 years that I've owned them. So I sent all 3 cards into my friend Frank from Retro Rewind. I may have mentioned him once or twice over the past couple of months. He's a great guy. He does, in addition to recapping items, he also does some light repair work too. So if you got a problem, give him a holler. Let him know what's going on. Maybe he can help you out. So he took my 3 A3640 cards, combined the parts from them to make 2 working A3640 cards, and recapped the 2 of those, and then, you know, they stole parts off the 3rd one that wasn't working right, upgraded both of them to the latest version, which is basically version 3.2 that should work in any Amiga 3000, and I got 2 really nice working cards out of the deal, which of course means I wanted to use them in my Amiga 3000. You may recall in my episode a couple of years ago about my warp engine for my Amiga 4000, that had a 68040 chip running at 40 megahertz in it, which is as fast as they made the 040s. I took that chip out and replaced it with one of those 68040 to 68060 adapters. Now my Amiga 4000 is running as a 68060, 66 megahertz in my warp engine. Works fine. So I had a spare 68040, 40 megahertz chip. I thought, those run really hot at 40 megahertz. I bet they run cooler at 25 megahertz, cooler even than a 25 megahertz chip would. So I stuck that little guy on one of my A3640s. Again, it's a 40 megahertz chip, but the oscillators on the boards are 25 megahertz. So it pops up as a 25 megahertz chip. It's literally underclocked. Normally we want to overclock stuff, but in this case, I'm trying to cool it down. I underclocked it to 25 megahertz. So I hooked it up to my Amiga 3000, turned it on, and started measuring the temperatures with my handy dandy trusty little thermometer here. And even at full load, when I'm processing graphics and moving files around with no heatsink, mind you, that chip was running at about 105 to 110 degrees Fahrenheit, which works out to about 43 degrees Celsius for you over there in Europe. These chips have a tolerance rated at about 150 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 65 degrees Celsius. So even without a heatsink, it was still well within the tolerances of the chip. Now, you try to run a 25 megahertz chip by itself with no heatsink in there, and that sucker is going to be 125, 130 degrees Fahrenheit very, very easily. So it's already running cooler. I pop my little heatsink on there, running full bore, editing graphics, moving stuff around, hitting the hard drive, running it for hours. I cannot get a temperature reading off that heatsink that's above about 87 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 30 degrees Celsius. Absolutely floored me. I figured it'd run it, 90, 95, 97, something like that, perfectly fine. This thing's running at a cool as a cucumber, 87 Fahrenheit. And that's not just the heatsink. I'm feeling the chip around it. The chip's nice and cool. It is amazing. Now, even my 25 megahertz 040, when I was running it on this machine, that heatsink got so hot. That was at least 110, 115 degrees easy with the heatsink on it, and the gals got so hot too, the little chips on the A3640 board. Now, all of them cool as a cucumber. It's wonderful. So we have a nice A3640 in our Amiga 3000. We've got it nice and running cool with a nice CPU cooler on there and a 40 megahertz chip clock at 25 megahertz. This thing's going to work flawlessly, right? Turn it on, everything's going to be peaches and cream. No, it's not. This is me we're talking about. See, there's a nasty problem with the SCSI controllers on Amiga 3000 desktops. They work fine with a 68030 running at 16 or 25 megahertz. They're well within tolerances, well within spec. Everything's working great. And they're actually really fast SCSI cards, or SCSI interfaces. They're great for its day. You introduce an 040 on there, and the faster timing, and it starts throwing disk errors like there's no tomorrow. I could use mine 5 or 6 minutes. Perfect. Everything was fine. I start doing something with the hard drive or the SD card. Check some error, check some error, check some error. Reboot. Oh, I guess it's working okay now. Boom, check some error, check some error. Every single time. Go back to the 030. Works fine. Now, it got to the point where it actually destroyed my partitions on my 32 gig SD card. I had a lot of cool stuff on there. Didn't lose anything. I have it all backed up. But it literally got to the point where it corrupts the partition and trashes the drive. First, I thought my SD card was just going bad. So I tried a second SD card, loaded an OS on it. It started crashing within minutes too. So in doing some research, putting out some feelers on Twitter, I realized that I wasn't the only one who had this problem. Lots of people who use an A3640 in an Amiga 3000 desktop, the SCSI controllers just does not work. And the issue is the DMAC chip and the Ramsey chip. The desktop versions generally came with DMAC version 2 and Ramsey version 4. That works perfectly fine with an 030. No serious issues at all. Use those same two chips on an 040, problems galore. So the permanent solution is upgrade your DMAC to an 04 version, upgrade your Ramsey to an 07, works great with an 040, but you can't get the DMAC anywhere. You can still get the Ramsey chips. Individual computers actually sell some, but you can't mix and match the DMAC and Ramsey. It has to be version 2 and version 4, or version 4 and version 7. Can't mix them up or your system will be unbootable. Now the really frustrating thing is some people's Amiga 3000s with the same version of DMAC and Ramsey, they work fine with accelerators because some of the DMAC chips had enough tolerance where it could handle it just fine. It could handle the higher speeds just fine. Most didn't, but sometimes you get lucky and one does. Now, the curious thing is, before I sent my board off to Chucky, I was running a 3640 board in there. I did my entire episode on the Amiga XT bridge board with an 040 board in there. Worked fine. SCSI worked fine for weeks, not a single error. So I honestly don't know if when Chucky took my old board in, if he popped off my Ramsey and my DMAC, put them in a pile, and put another one in there and didn't reuse my actual parts. I may have had a DMAC that was a good one that worked with intolerances. Who knows where it is now, but no way to prove it. Friend on Twitter, Charlie Below, was really quite helpful in troubleshooting this. He pointed me towards some of the articles where they're talking about this issue. And he even pointed out how some people were able to correct it by changing the mask in your HD toolbox settings. You know, we've got max transfer, we've got the mask. Changing the mask settings to this number right here that you see right there. Normally there's an F on the end, change it to a C on the end, and that sometimes helps people. It relates to how it caches hard drive information to memory and what part of memory it caches it to. And believe it or not, it really, really helped mine. I could go 10 or 15 minutes without a checksum error. The thing would just be perfect. But the minute I started doing something really intensive, like moving a 300 megabyte directory to another part of the drive, the checksum errors would come back. So it helped, but it wasn't a permanent solution. But it may help some people that have DMAC chips that are right on the edge of tolerance. So I've got this honey of an Amiga 3000 with a beautiful, nice, cool running 040 chip in it. Can't use it because my SCSI fails. So what am I going to do? Well, my good friend Level Lord, who won the Amiga Art Contest of 2019, the first one, here's his winning picture right there. A couple of, maybe a year or so ago, he sent me a box of Amiga goodies he was not using, and included in the box was this theoretical, non-working Fastlane Z3 card. This card is a 03, theoretically supports up to 16 megabytes of RAM using these 1 meg chips, 64 megabytes of RAM using 4 meg chips, which I'm going to order, or even in theory 256 megabytes using 16 megabyte chips that are almost impossible to find. The other cool thing about it is it's got a nice fast SCSI 2 interface on it because this board was designed for the Amiga 4000. You can see it's a big board. In doing a lot of research on this board, a lot of people said they could get the RAM to work in their Amiga 3000, but they could rarely get the SCSI interface to work, so they didn't bother. Didn't matter anyways, because you got onboard SCSI. I thought, you know, let's try it out. I've never even tried the SCSI on this board. I just use it for the 16 megs of RAM. Hooked up my SCSI cable, direct to my SCSI to SD, boom, cracked right off, worked beautifully, worked flawlessly. I was able to transfer information left and right, decompress stuff, install programs. I have not seen a checksum error on this. I'm one of the lucky ones where the Fastlane Z3 cards actually work as advertised in the Amiga 3000. And part of that is the fact that this little guy has a Buster 11 chip in it, which increases compatibility with Zorro 3 cards. You're sitting there thinking, Douglas, I don't have a Zorro 3 SCSI card for my Amiga 3000, yet I've got an A3640 I want to use. What can I do if the SCSI's not going to work properly, or probably won't? Well, our friend Jens over at icomp.de, Individual Computers, has a Bhudda IDE interface. Now this is a Zorro 2 card, but of course it'll work fine in Amiga 3000. It adds IDE right to your Amiga 3000. $75 plus shipping. You get that shipped over, you pop it in there, you're using IDE on a CF card instead of SCSI. Is it not as good as the onboard SCSI? Not really. More versatile in some ways, but it's fantastic. It'll work fine. It doesn't care about your DMAC and your Ramsey chips. $75. Problem solved. So let's just see how fast our expanded Amiga 3000 is. Now our trusty sysinfo will be our first stop, because nobody ever complains about sysinfo, nor do they ever have anything bad to say about it. It is perfect. Let's take a look at the speed here. We're going to run the good old speed test and see how fast she is. And look at those numbers. We're talking 18,584 dry stones. 35 times faster than an A600, 4 times faster than an Amiga 3000, and 1.0 times an Amiga 4000 at 25 megahertz, which is just about true. Absolutely beautiful. Now, let's look at the drive speed on here. We're going to check DH0 here, see how fast we are. And we're about 2.5 megabytes per second on DH0, and DH1 seems to be a little faster at 3.2 megs per second. Now, in theory, this fast lane card should be able to handle 5 to 7 megabytes per second, and I'll do some tweaking to see if I can get her to speed up a little bit. Now, another good utility is AIBB, and this actually tells a very, very similar story. We're going to tell everything to use an 020, and we're going to tell everything that can use the coprocessor math, and we're going to take a look at a few of the tests here. See, this says it's a 68040 running at 25 megahertz. EMU test, see if it's an EMU. It is an EMU. Look at that. We are 16.54 compared to 16.09 on an Amiga 4000, and 5 times faster than an Amiga 3000. This is a very telling test right here. This I ran on my Amiga 600, and it takes about 3.5 days to finish. Right here, so fast. You see there's an Amiga 600, there's me. Now, here you're going to see that the Amiga 4000 is a little faster, just because the AGA chipset is a little faster. Here's another good one, beach ball test. Look how fast it renders that beach ball. Da-da-da-dum. 156 coup rate, which is about the same as an Amiga 4000. Look, 156 times faster than an Amiga 600. Absolutely brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. And all of these tests tell us about the same story, that it's neck and neck with an Amiga 4000, and between 4 and 7 times faster than an Amiga 3000, depending on which test it's doing. Real world tests are important too, and this flies. Like when I'm using Art Department Professional and I'm bringing in an image, let's say we're going to we'll bring in this image here, and we're going to resize the image. We're going to scale it, and we're going to make it 204% bigger. Beautiful. When you're doing the actual scaling, this works so much faster than the 030. It's at least 4 times faster than the 030 when you're doing editing images. When you're doing 3D rendering, it's literally 4 to 5 times faster every single time. Absolutely worth it. Now let's load up a 1280 by 720 ham6 image and render it at 362 by 482. And it renders really, really a lot faster than an A30 and about 1,000,000 times faster than a 68,000 or an Amiga 1200. Look at the pretty colors. If you're using WHD load, most games are going to work just fine on an A40 processor. You're not really going to have any problems with those at all. There are some programs, some games that just don't cooperate with a 68040, but I got a couple other Amigas I can use if I want to do those. For productivity applications, flawless. So should you upgrade your Amiga 3000 with an A3640? If you have one, can't hurt. Just be careful, be aware of the problems you're going to run into, and make an effort to avoid those problems. Get yourself a nice thin heatsink. Get yourself a Bhudda IDE controller because your SCSI is probably not going to work. It's worth a try to see if it does work, but don't do it with the only copy of Workbench you have because it could corrupt the entire partition. Now, how about these new A3660 boards, which are basically just upgraded A3640 technologies designed to work with an actual 68,000 chip? Those are awesome. They still don't have RAM, they still don't have a hard drive controller, but they're fast little puppies. Do they have the same issues in an Amiga 3000? Not the heat issues, because by default, the A60 runs cooler than an A40, so it won't have exactly the same heat issues. Is it going to have the same SCSI issues? I don't know. Probably, unless you have a newer DMAC and a newer Ramsey, it will probably have the same issues, but I'm not sure. Huge thanks to my wonderful patrons who you see being displayed over a 1280 by 720 Ham6 picture. Yep, 100% Ham6 picture created on my Amiga 3000 at 1280 by 720 resolution. How'd I do that? Well, that's for another episode. If you want to join this prestigious list and help support the channel, pop on over to patreon.com/10mark for more information. Thanks, everybody. So thanks for joining me today on this little primer on how to use an A3640 on your Amiga 3000. Please like and subscribe, comment below, tell me your experience in upgrading your Amiga 3000. Did you cook yours like I did a couple of months ago? Let me know what you did to resolve the issue with SCSI. Did you ever find a DMAC 4 and Ramsey 7? And if so, send them to me. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. All the links are in the description. But until next time, this is Doug from 10 Minute Amiga Retrocast, signing out.